And just to kind of go over just a little bit, like I said, I kind of liked Islam because this is when I became a right winger because, because it kind of subjugated women and stuff. And again, I became more of a for pro-white, white supremacist, but at least pro-white. Whereas when I was a communist, I was anti-white and I was anti-religion. But when I became more pro-white, I kind of liked Islam because I was like, yeah, it subjugates women, and I thought that was good for the white genes, right? And but I didn't like the idea that of race mixing that I thought that Islam promoted, but I like the idea that it subjugated women, and also, like I said, when I was like a leftist, I didn't like punishment for law, because in my mind as a communist, I'm like, yeah, the oppressed is always the good guys and the oppressors the bad guys, and the only reason why black people go to jail is because they've been oppressed, and it's because of the white man, and so we should, jail is not helpful, and it doesn't actually really help people, and doesn't, so I was kind of like BLM, right? Like anti-jail, anti-cops, it doesn't really help, it's just to maintain the white supremacy and blah blah blah, right? That's the way that I saw things. But and I thought it was just like kind of Darwinian, and I want to destroy religion, race mixing, and everything. I want to create race mixing, but I liked Islam only in that it was anti. I thought it was more anti-white. I was just anti-white. I saw myself as Jewish, and I saw white people as bad. But then when I started talking to my grandpa after I became pro-white and I started like Islam, but then my grandpa was like, I like the idea that that women, for instance, were not allowed to talk in court. But then my grandpa was like, well, that's not necessarily what Islam teaches. I told my grandpa this, and I was like, what? And he was like, Islam doesn't, and I like the idea of women wearing burqas. And my grandpa was like, that's not necessarily what Islam teaches. And I was like, what? So again, I was confused. I was like, is my grandpa a liberal? Is he a leftist or a right wing? Because I couldn't tell. Uh, but I do think that one of the stereotypes of black men is that black men are hypersexual, so they want to make their women wear burqas and stuff because they're like animals, right? But I like the idea of the subjugation of women. But my grandpa taught, like, he told me that, like, basically what his idea was, and I looked it up later, and there was some like evidence to corroborate this by leftists, and they were saying like, no, actually Muhammad was, blessing and peace be upon him, he was liberal for his time, and he was actually moving the Arabs more toward liberalism. So, like, for instance, when the women would wear the burqas, before, women would have to cover their whole bodies, but Muhammad, blessed be upon him, he and before they would like bury women alive, but actually Muhammad was saying don't bury women alive, and he wanted his wives to cover his hair, but he was moving toward not, I guess, and also like women had to have a chaperone when they talked in court, and my grandma was saying that's not necessarily what Muhammad taught, blessed be upon him, but so I was thinking, I like the idea that of subjugation of women, because I wanted to maintain the white race, and I thought that the feminism was against the white race. But then my grandpa was like, it's not, my grandpa's teaching transcendent dualistic software, and that one aspect of dualistic software would be promiscuity, because that confirms the idea of a separate self through sexual intercourse and through sensual gratification. But my grandpa would also say, like, but also subjugation is not necessarily the answer either. So the idea was that Muhammad, when I looked up what the liberals said, they were saying Muhammad, blessed and peace be upon him, he didn't necessarily want, he was moving them to actually, because before women weren't allowed to talk at all in court, but now Muhammad was saying that they can have a chaperone. And the idea was he was moving the Arabs more toward where women would be allowed to talk in court. But again, so when I was becoming more of a liberal, though, I took all this, I was like, oh yeah, good. Oh, so Muhammad was a liberal. And again, but see myself as Jewish, I wanted race mixing, and I wanted to promote degeneracy, and I wanted to promote like free sexuality, because again, the way I look at things is like, yeah, well, hypersexuality can be closer to the flow, because as my grandpa taught me, being prude isn't necessarily the flow, because that's still self-confirmatory. You're conforming, and conforming is not necessarily the flow. It's kind of like basketball. If you conform and you shoot like the way the coaches say to shoot, square, you're not gonna shoot good. But non-conforming is also not the flow. And that would be like shooting like super sideways. But the flow would be like shooting perfect. But my grandpa would say like that the flow, that non-conformity could be closer to the flow. So I'm like, yeah, well, hypersexuality can be closer to the flow than prudeness. But again, like, and that's kind of like what Freud taught, and like Wilhelm Reich, they taught like free sexuality is more mentally healthy. But then there's conservatives who say no, Freud and Wilhelm Reich and those Jewish guys, they were just trying to promote free sexuality because they were trying to destroy Christianity and destroy the white race. But that's the way I kind of was. But, you know, so my grandpa would say, like, neither one would necessarily be the flow, right? But you know, I wanted to see the good is bad and the bad is good. The black man is bad, and black people are more associated with hypersexuality. And the white man is more associated with being prude, right? But I wanted to see the black man is good and the white man is bad, and I wanted race mixing. That's basically it. I just wanted to destroy the white race because I saw myself as Jewish. So I became more liberal again. But then I was studying with my grandpa more and more, and I remember I was reading this Chabad book with my grandpa. And like I said, my grandpa always confused me because he seemed to be anti-religious. And he even said something like, I asked him, like, what do you think of Freud's idea that religion's a neurosis? And my grandpa's like, that could be true, yeah. So I'm like, okay, so my grandpa's anti-religious. But what my grandpa was saying is, you know, you want to transcend all beliefs so that you could be in the flow, which is the truth. And, you know, being anti-religious, I was anti-religious because I saw religion as white supremacist and maintaining the white race, and I wanted to destroy the white race. So I was still in the ego. But, you know, my grandpa, he was more rational. So he would see the Bible as like metaphorical and not. And so I like that idea because I like the idea of destroying religion, you know, kind of like, you know, because I wanted to race mix the white people, and I thought that religion promotes white supremacy. But then I like I said, I took my grandpa to Chabad in Malibu, and my grandpa was like, he liked it, you know, because the woman, my grandpa was not allowed to touch the rabbi's wife, and I was like, in my mind, I'm like, see, it's just white supremacy. They just want to subjugate women to maintain the white race, and they're just secretly white supremacists, the Chabad. You know, but then I asked my grandpa was like, no, that's a beneficial ritual to not touch, because, you know, touching could be self-confirmatory and you want to transcend the self. And again, it wouldn't necessarily transcend the self, but my grandpa would say those rituals can serve a purpose of just following rituals in and of itself can take you out of what my grandpa would call your habits, your circumstances, and your relationships, which are all self-confirmatory, your habits, and just following rituals in and of itself can help you to get in the flow by taking you out of your habits. So I'm listening to this, I'm like, okay, so my grandpa's not anti-religious. So I'm like, I'm confused, because I thought that he was anti-religious, so I was like, okay, well, maybe my grandpa's a leftist. And he's anti-white like me. But then my grandpa's like saying this stuff, and I'm like, oh, so he is still a white supremacist. He still is a right-winger, and he still is for the white people. So I'm confused. I'm like, okay, so he isn't for like hypersexuality. Like, so I was just confused. I was like, so what is my grandpa? I was just confused at the time. But like I said, I'm going to start understanding more later in 2021 when I start reading Dr. Hort's books, but I'm going to get to that. So I'm confused, but I'm like, okay, so my grandpa might be right. So I became more of a right-winger again. And because, you know, my like one thing was like my grandpa, he liked the movie The Da Vinci Code, because in the Da Vinci Code, the guy's like hyper religious, and he's hitting himself. He's slapping himself with this thing, and because he's trying to go to heaven, he thinks that by punishing himself he'll go to heaven. And so my grandpa's like, that's hyper religiosity, and that's not the flow. And he liked that idea. But my grandpa would say that the real Holy Grail is the flow. And there is no Holy Grail, because my grandpa would say Holy Grail is a container and the flow cannot be contained. So I'm listening, I'm like, okay. So I'm like, okay, so he's against religion. But then again, though, but really, I'm gonna get to this. But my grandpa was also we watched the book, or we watched the movie, what was it? The Fiddler on the Roof. And my grandpa was like, yeah, the Fiddler on the Roof represents the flow, because he's in discovery. My grandpa say discovery is a flow. He said people are either in discovery, disaster, or dullness. And he's saying discovery is a part of the flow. And, you know, people will skydive and stuff so they could be a part of disaster, because that raises their level of lightness, because they want to transcend the self. Or they're in dullness, which my grandpa would say is self-confirmatory. But he said discovery is, you know, you want to be in discovery, and you want to be on the precipice. You don't want to be content and comfortable. You want to be on the roof playing the fiddle, right? In creativity, right? So I'm listening to my grandpa. I'm like, okay. So I'm listening, but my grandpa was saying, like, he didn't like the people in the Fiddler on the Roof, because remember the woman's like, oh, we suffer. She's a Jewish woman. She's like, and so we continue to suffer. And my grandpa was like, you see, that's dualistic software. But again, this is why I saw my grandpa's white supremacist, because he's against suffering. Because, you know, it's kind of a Nietzschean idea, like it's idea that it's self-confirmatory and people get a sense of gratification from suffering if they think that suffering makes you superior. And my grandpa's saying that suffering is self-confirmatory. You want to transcend the self, and you don't need to suffer. Suffering doesn't make you superior. But the Nietzschean idea. So again, I'm looking at this. I'm thinking, okay, this is a little bit white supremacy. It's white supremacy. You're looking down upon Jews because they suffer. And I'm like, like I said, my grandpa would teach that, like, the Jews, if they were in the flow, they wouldn't have been enslaved. And in a way, and there's some truth to this. So again, I see this as victim blaming, but this idea that, like, the Jews want to suffer, so they suffer. And I'm like, I'm trying to understand this stuff. And like I said, there was this one time, but I was like, is my grandpa anti-religious? Because in the Fiddler of the Roof, it seems like he's trying to move out of religion a little bit. But there's also the guy in Fiddler on the Roof who was like a communist, and my grandpa's like, that's not the flow either. So I'm trying to understand my grandpa's teachings. I'm like, okay, he's against suffering, so like that's kind of white supremacy, kind of victim blaming. What else what was my grandpa teaching me? So I'm trying to, at this point in my life, it's like 2016. I'm trying to understand my grandpa's teachings. I know there's something profound about it. But at the same time, I'm like, is he just a white supremacist? Is he? I can't really quite get my finger on it. And then my grandpa was teaching me, like, he was saying, I asked my grandpa, like, okay, I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, so, I mean, it's sad that my grandpa died, and like the other day, I was really upset about it, but, it is what it is. But so the thing though was, like, I remember I would get in arguments with my grandpa about, because I would be like, because my grandpa would be, he would, his whole thing was like independence and stuff, and kind of like, that's a part of the flow. But then, so then I'd be like, well, what about my mom and dad? Like, my mom's trying to make me independent, and then she neglects me. And my grandpa's like, yeah, well, that's not really the flow. She's not really in the flow. That's predator prey software, and she's still in the lower level of software. But I'll be like, but grandpa, your teachings, I felt like they were white supremacy, and they led to, like, they were like conservative and like led to lack of compassion. And like, so my mom that's the way my mom interpreted it. She thought that my grandpa was teaching, like, to throw me to the side and make him independent. And my grandpa said that compassion is a part of the flow. But again, true compassion, not empathy, because my grandpa would say that empathy is not necessarily the flow, because empathy is feeling what the other person feels. But my grandpa would say feelings don't matter. Feelings aren't important, because feelings are shaped by the ego. Like, for instance, when I see myself as a Jew, I would feel bad for the black people. I feel bad for the black people and the Mexican people. This is a good example. I remember one time, but again, it was my ego though, because I wanted them to defeat the white people, and race makes the white people. So was it really true compassion? Was it really compassion, a oneness consciousness, or was it a empathy feeling that was distorted by my ego? And one example of that was, like, I remember one time my grandpa came to pick me up when I was in Escondido. Yeah, I forget why, but I think he was helping me move or something. Yeah, he's helping me move or something. Or he was bringing me a mattress or something. I forget. But I remember there was some Mexican people. And at the time I was thinking my grandpa's a liberal, because he's telling me to transcend dualistic software and stuff. And I'm thinking, okay, that's race mixing. So I was moving again. I moved more toward liberal. But then I'm going to get to how I moved toward the right wing again. But so I looked at the Mexican people, and I looked at these little Mexican kids running around. I was like, hey, I said, I forget how I said it, but I said to my grandpa something like, I really like this. I just like seeing Mexican kids. It just makes me feel good. Like, and again, that was because I saw myself as a Jew, and I didn't like white people, so I like to see the Mexican kids. Again, it seems like, oh, that's nice. You like Mexican people, Ryan? But no, I wanted race mixing. I wanted to destroy the white race. So that's why when I would see little Mexican kids, I'd be like, oh, I like that. I like that. So, and then my grandpa said something like, yeah, well, yeah, they're a little bit more simple-minded, and they're very simple, and that can be nice to see that sometimes. And so, again, I was like, oh, my grandpa's a white supremacist. I was like, but my grandpa was catching me on what I liked. I liked them because I thought that they were against the white race, and it was helping to defeat the white race. And that's because I saw myself as Jewish. So my grandpa was helping me to see things transcend, but at the time I still didn't get it. So, but then I was reading this book at Chabad that I got from Chabad, and like, one of it said, there was this one thing in the Chabad book. It was about the Babylonian Empire and how they would conquer the Jews, and they conquered all these people, and they would make idols, but on the idols it would have the YHWH, the name of the Tetragrammaton, so the idols could actually speak. And I asked my grandpa, what do you think about that? And my grandpa was like, well, there was a higher aspiration in their colonization. And it was a desire for oneness. What people really want is oneness. And so I'm thinking to myself, oh, so he's just justifying, but not oneness as in like race mixing necessarily, but that's what I think. Like that's what I would like is oneness of race mixing. But I'm thinking he's just justifying colonization because my grandpa would say that like when the Europeans had a higher aspiration, they're bringing people together and they're breaking people out of their parochial views because there is one truth. And this desire to bring oneness, bring globalism is that desire to bring about oneness, to recognition that there is one truth, that there is one flow. And that would really be the transcendence of the body. But I like globalism because I was thinking race mixing, defeat the white man. But my grandpa, that's not what he meant by globalism. My grandpa liked globalism too, but not necessarily that. So I'm confused, but when my grandpa's saying this, I'm like, oh, so he's just justifying colonialism. He's saying there was something good about it. But I didn't like colonialism. I was like, that's the white man. Of course my grandpa wants to justify colonialism because my grandpa's saying that's why the idols could speak, because the tetragrammaton is on the idols, and what that's saying is that even behind the colonialism, God was behind that. Even behind like the killing of all the people. But I didn't like that. Remember? I didn't like Christianity. And so when my grandpa's trying to teach me like, no, there's a higher aspiration behind it, even like Christianity, my grandpa would say, yeah, the higher aspiration behind Christianity is saying that, that Jesus is the only way is the idea that there is one flow. There is one truth. And that's the flow and whatever. So I'm like, I'm trying to understand this. So then, so what happened? What was I going to say? There's a lot that I wanted to say. Okay, so then I'm moving a little bit more toward the right wing because my grandpa was teaching me, like, he was teaching me about Cain and Abel and how Cain and Abel, because I wanted to see Cain and Abel as, the nomads are the good guys, and that's Abel, and Cain is the bad guy, and he's the agriculturalist, and I want to see the nomads as the good guys because they're more the black people and the white people are bad. But my grandpa's like, no, they're not necessarily bad. It's a part of the evolutionary part of existence, and that's just what happens. And not necessarily one is good and bad. That good and bad is dualistic software. There's complexities and stuff, right? But I didn't quite understand it. But so I'm thinking like, okay, he's just a white supremacist. He's just justifying the agriculturalists killing the nomads, the white people killing the black people and stuff. So I was, but at the same time, he's moving me more toward the right wing. So I'm like, okay, so my grandpa maybe is a white supremacist. He seems to be a white supremacist. He's talking about like there's a higher aspiration behind colonialism and all this stuff. And I'm like, okay. And then the other thing was my grandpa taught me like we're not all, because I asked him, are we all equal? And he was like, no. He said we're all one, but we're not all equal. So because the reason why I said that was because I told him about this other thing I read in a Chabad book about how the Tower of Babel was a desire to make everybody one and everybody speak the same language, and that was a failed attempt. So it was like anti-globalism, anti-making everybody one, and it was for diversity. So it was actually a good thing that the Tower of Babel fell down, because it was a desire to force everybody to speak one language to mix everybody. So I was like, well, what do you think about that, Grandpa? Like, are the Chabad people white supremacists? They don't want everybody to mix, because I wanted everybody to mix. I was anti-white, and I was a liberal, leftist. But then my grandpa was like, no, forcing everybody to mix isn't necessarily the flow. So I'm like, okay. And my grandpa was saying, because, that could be forcing things, and that could not necessarily be the flow. So I'm like, okay, so my grandpa's on the Chabad side. My grandpa is a white supremacist. He is for nationalism, Now, my grandpa would say that nationalism, there's levels. So nationalism is a step in the right direction because you're part of something greater than yourself, which is a nation. But then my grandpa would say that beyond nationalism is globalism, where you go even beyond the nation and you see yourself as one global community. But I thought that globalism was race mixing. My grandpa would be like, no, it's not necessarily race mixing. You don't necessarily need a race mix because not everybody's equal. Everything is one, but if you're in the flow, it doesn't necessarily mean you race mix. Now, this is when I started to move a little bit more toward right wing. So I'm like, okay, so you are a nationalist, more of a nationalist. You are more of a white supremacist. So I was like, okay, so maybe and I became more of a right winger again. And then this is about the time when Trump became elected, and I was a right winger. And I met my friend Rohan, who was an Indian guy who was kind of a right winger. Or he's not really a right winger, but he was kind of I don't know if you could even call him a right winger, but I remember he was racist against black people. But then yeah, so I'm trying to, so again I kind of shifted again more toward the right wing, and so I'll get more toward that. Yeah, so I became more pro-white again, and but like when I was a leftist, I remember there was a story about the Amalekites, and they were saying that like the Amalekites wouldn't give to the Jews when they left Egypt, and I was thinking like, oh, okay, the Amalekites, they're white supremacists, they're anti-welfare and stuff, and they're like my grandpa. And the Bible says to kill the Amalekites, so yeah, to kill the white people. We should kill the Germans. They're the Amalekites. I remember I would have like fantasies of like FEMA camps, like, and I would get the Christians and put them in the FEMA camps and destroy them. And so that's the way I really was. Or like if I got power, I would like nuke the white race and stuff. Like that's the way I saw things. But I wanted to like pretend like I was on, like I would, if I did get power, I'd pretend like I was on their side, but then I would take them out. I was anti-white. So, but my grandpa's kind of teaching me these things, and it's moving me more toward like, I'm confused. But so I started moving more toward right wing again. And this is when Donald Trump became the president. And I remember I was a white supremacist kind of at the time. Like I was kind of vacillating. I always vacillated, like, because I was trying to understand my grandpa's teachings. But I think always at the core of me, though, I always saw myself as Jewish, and there was a part of me that wanted to race mix the white people, to defeat the white people. Even when I became kind of pro-white, there was always at that core, me seeing myself as Jewish, and Jews. That's why I think a lot of people say a lot of Jews don't like white people, because Jews see white people as a threat. And that's why Jews tend to promote things that promote the destruction of the white people. So, I'll get more into what happens next in the story, but my point is, and I'll get to when I started to understand my grandpa's teachings more in 2021 when I read Dr. Horace's books, or no, 2020 when I started reading Dr. Horace's books. So.